question.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So I'm David Dansereau. I'm a principal out of the Parievda office, the Parievda Houston office. And basically, Ryan and I are going to kind of talk about what data governance means in the modern data world. So as we move forward, this track will really zoom into the innovation and control aspects of the modern data enterprise, which is the governance and operations of data platforms themselves. Our hope is by the end of this session, you'll understand what we mean when it comes to data governance and how we've transitioned over towards data ops, which Ryan will jump into. Additionally, I highly suggest you go watch the recordings of the other tracks after this, or another option would be to talk to colleagues or friends that you know who are in attendance but viewing the value or the technology tracks themselves, just so that you get a clear and whole picture of what we mean when we talk about the modern data enterprise. So to start, I think it's probably best to take a step back and ask the question, what exactly is data governance? People probably have preconceived notions of what that means. Maybe it's partial or fully correct. But really, data governance is a collection of a lot of smaller components, subcomponents, if you will, which are focused on reporting and compliance, quality management, master data and metadata management, and a big one being data security. So these are the aspects that historically have burned companies when it comes to their data, and that governance is focused on controlling and trying to fix. Data governance really, though, if you think about it from a value perspective, is making sure that your company's data is secure, accessible, and trustworthy to maximize business value for an organization. So when we think about, well, what really does that mean from a focus standpoint for data governance, it hasn't really changed over time. If you've ever been involved with a data governance project or organization, these components, these tenets have kind of remained tried and true, right? Thinking through data quality, and it's really about earning trust in your organization's data. Poor data quality has been estimated, I think, since 2017, according to Gartner, to cost companies upwards of $15 million a year. So data quality is number one in my book. Making data accessible, making sure that you're compliant, making sure that your data is available to those who are trying to access it, have always been parts of data governance and what they're trying to solve for. And ultimately, what a lot of people probably focus in on when it comes to data governance is data security. And as we know, with many data breaches over the past recent years, even across industries such as the entertainment industry with Sony, this is a big one, right? Data security is a big component of data governance, and oftentimes I think what people really think about when it comes to governance. So these are just a few examples of some of the tenets. There's also scalability, flexibility, discoverability, but we'll move forwards with these as kind of the thoughts that we're going with when it comes to data governance. So the question becomes really, why now? Data governance has been around for quite some time. It's had, I would say, probably less success than many would hope since the mid 90s. And so why are we bringing it up now? Because what really has changed? So that the answer to that is that data continually changes, right? It's been growing exponentially at a rate of 2 times per year, or I'm sorry, 2 times every 2 years. So now we've gotten to the point where the estimates for data in 2025 are at 175 trillion gigabytes, which I don't really know what that means, but it seems really large, right? So, with this data growth comes, other forecasted value that organizations should try to be leveraging when it comes to their data, such as AI augmentation, which is estimated to create $2.9 trillion of business value in 2021. So when we think about how does governance come into play here, this little graphic kind of shows governance being the funnel, right? And the objective would be, how do you widen that funnel without breaking the machine, the governance machine, right? To ingest as much data as you can when it comes to, trying to add as much value to your organization, and effectively manage it, right? So that you can drive business values downstream and have analytics and trustworthy dashboards that the business can use. Lastly, if we think about this surge of data, right now, I would say organizations are largely unprepared to effectively utilize that data. And an example of that being, 1% of unstructured data right now is estimated to be used or analyzed by organizations. And, for example, IoT data is primarily unstructured data. So we're really going to talk through kind of the goal here being widening that funnel. And let's kind of talk about why the traditional approach of data governance doesn't really work. So when we think about traditional data governance, many of you may have experience here. It's largely a manual, human resource dependent approach when trying to resolve all of the governance shortfalls of an organization. This is particularly true when it comes to things like data quality management, having data stewards go in and try to correct issues and source data like manually changing it. And that's an old way of thinking about things. So as we think of the world of today here in 2020, if we think about what that governance approach looks like, you'll see when this graphic pops up that it doesn't really scale all that well. You're adding a lot of headcount here, and while you're trying to achieve a better governance goal, you're actually adding more risk to your governance because, as we know, people are all different and they aren't uniform when decision making, such as our technology tools and solutions could be. So additionally, while you try to scale this governance approach, you ultimately are just kind of staying at a status quo when it comes to how you're doing governance today. So that if you take the 2014 approach, think about how your data has grown to 2020, add the appropriate amount of people to scale data management, you're not adding to your data governance abilities. You're really just staying put, as you can see in that little graph there in the middle. And ultimately, you'll get to a point where it's just impossible to keep scaling people like this. So, besides this highly manual pitfall, right, which we just kind of talked through, here are some others that we often see at Parievda that are challenges to data governance. So an example of a cautionary tale when going down that highly manual route is that we've worked with a company that went down this approach, had a very manual Excel process to create operating reports. And unfortunately, that company misreported $10 million in surplus in revenue in one quarter because somebody had mistyped a function in an Excel spreadsheet. So these are the types of disasters we're trying to avoid, and hopefully can caution folks here in the presentation about. Another problem moving across the bubbles here on the screen is, oftentimes we see tech being the driver before governance when it comes to creating data platforms and lakes. That can unfortunately lead to, longer data platform project timelines because, you're now moving into phase 2 or 3 to address some of the governance that you ignored when you were building out the technology, when you were probably more efficient if you are thinking through governance needs while building out the technology, because it can affect the solutions that you're picking out. A waterfall approach is probably the most common pitfall that I think historically data governance has seen, which is an organization analyzing all the governance problems that they can think through, and it's this large assessment period right before they can actually start implementing anything that shows value. And that long gap of assessment time usually is what cans a governance project, because it's such a delay to get some value from the organization. And lastly, focusing more security rather than quality, for example, when it comes to governance, can easily turn things like a data lake into a data swamp for maybe a worn out term, right? And so, lacking that data quality in your data lake turns things into a swamp, which makes your analytics less than valuable. So let's kind of talk about, the data governance maturity model that we see here in Parievda and how we're trying to help our customers move across this board, right? So, we've kind of seen some of the pitfalls, and what we try to do with data governance is get past this loop here that we see which is where many of our customers find themselves in the uncontrolled and reactive states. You know, many times customers think they're further along in this governance maturity framework than they really are. And so that it makes them stuck in an uncontrolled state due to past failures with data governance. And sometimes, you know, our customers think they're more reactive than they really are, which actually means they're uncontrolled, which could be even worse in terms of having a false narrative about where your governance is. And because of all this, you know, oftentimes data governance is the weakest pillar with our clients when we're engaged in an MDE project. And that's really due to the capabilities and the abilities that haven't scaled with the data growth, kind of like we talked about before. In the essence of time at this point, I'll turn it over to Ryan so he can talk through how we're trying to drive organizations out of this, you know, this perpetual loop here and get our clients in a more proactive and resilient data governance space. So Ryan, take it away.
Thanks, David. So yeah, I think the point we're illustrating here that a lot of times organizations find themselves stuck in this loop where you take on a master data management or data quality initiative, it starts to scale up and then it peters out and scales back down, is something that we've seen get killed over the last 3 years. We shared at the beginning here stories since 2017 that traditional approaches just aren't able to keep up with the scale at even our mid-sized clients. And so in order to really take that jump from a reactive state and move towards proactive data governance, we need to take advantage of some of the recent increases in technology capability. So over on the platform track, people will be learning about our Data Forge data platform framework. And this enables governance using a new technique. So leveraging technology within your data catalog to track the lineage of data, to enable cloning so that you can build out your data quality initiatives in a lower environment and then promote it into production rather than just always doing everything in production, which has been the norm with data initiatives over time, is now possible, where really even 3 years ago, it would have been very difficult to piece together the technology platform in order to enable a different approach. And so what does that new approach actually look like is, I think, the key question for driving forward your data governance maturity to the point where you can actually realize the benefits of being in that proactive mode. And to us, the techniques that you use are what are starting to crystallize under an approach called data ops. So data ops is all about applying software development best practices to your data development lifecycle. It takes an influence from agile software delivery methodologies where you can iteratively build value on top of your data. DevOps in terms of keeping track of everything as code and leveraging automated tests in a significant way to both ensure repeatability as you implement something so that you can handle that scale, and then tie in other concerns as checks along the way. So it leverages the platform to make governance activities like quality management, access control, security checks, part of the value delivery lifecycle. And then to pull in something that's a little bit more specific to data, looking at lean manufacturing approaches where the tests that you build are not only used to prove the validity of what you're going to push into production in that DevOps type approach of everything as code, but also once you're in production to keep track of the fact that the data that flows through your data pipelines that deliver the data products that you're realizing value from is outside of the control of the people who build the pipelines and the platforms underneath of that. So by using some of the same testing approaches that you had for DevOps, you can apply data quality statistical process controls to your pipelines and determine where you may have issues. So in doing a shift from a traditional analytics development approach that might look like, you basically cut the bottom of this diagram off, you build everything out, and then you have governance meetings as you get to the end of your pipeline development to determine whether security was applied appropriately, to determine whether you're using the right source of master data, and meet many of the other goals we discussed earlier. Now what you're doing is having that as part of the ideation process, making it the encoding to ensure that you're meeting those goals, part of the development process, and we'll get into the details in just a second on that. So finally, once you move to production, your governance gate step of checking to make sure that you're following all of the best practices that are required to reduce risk associated to this value are greatly minimized. So to take a look at what that looks like in a little bit more practical terms here, let's say you have a hypothetical and very generic data platform here that has a production environment and a separate development environment. First step you do is come up with an idea of a data product you want to be able to build. Second, you'd set up your development environment. So you'd bring across, using some of those potentially data cloning capabilities, or at least copying in some of the key data sets along the way, assuming that you've already built out some other data pipelines and that you have a data lake available. You then design that data product, leveraging what you know about from what's already there, and also what additional data you would need to bring into the platform. You can focus then on the data ingestion problem of how do you get that data from where it lives right now. And you can see we're looking right now at a sample financial services use case where you would set up ingestion, build out the tests that ensure that the data ingested into your platform is locked down, especially in this very raw form, to only those really advanced users who have a need to know. And potentially in this dev environment, also anonymized in case some of this data contains sensitive information. Those tests would also potentially cover key data quality needs of the specific data product that you're trying to build. So in this case, let's say you're building a dashboard that shows how market performance ties back to some of the results within your consumer banking division. So the next step there would be to build a prototype with your data science team of the end-to-end data flow here, not necessarily taking into account all of the stages necessary, but really getting to the point where you can show that dashboard to your stakeholders that are going to be driving decisions based on it. And this applies whether it's a dashboard, an AI model, real-time alerts sent to your customers. The type of data product you're trying to deliver doesn't really matter here. The key thing is, during this step, you haven't actually really applied a lot of the detailed data governance concerns yet, because you want to make sure that you've got the right data product first. Next step then is, once you get to the point where you see the value being returned, and you can certainly talk to your colleagues or watch back the value track to understand what we mean by see the value in the data product you've designed, then you can start to break down your model into a number of different steps. So you can apply that master data management to make sure that you're sourcing everything correctly and contributing master data to your overall organizational model in an earlier stage. Build the tests around that cover what we were talking about before around access management, data quality, deduplication, so forth. And then build out the remainder of the transformations needed to improve that data model to the point where you have everything in a production ready state, at which point you can define your end state access policies for your dashboards. Your end-to-end testing might be manual using QA. A lot of times though, you can do test data development and development over here. And then finally, you can promote that model into production. And along each of these arrows, you can leverage the tests that you built during development to ensure that statistical process control shows you that, if your banking data goes bad, you'll get an alert that something is going wrong here in your ingestion. Or if somebody deploys another version of this that breaks your modeling and enhancements, you'll get an alert that something seems wrong. Finally, once you've verified that the data portion of this is working in production, you promote the live use case here, and you start to work on realizing the value, running the experiments to show that the new data-driven approach drives real results. And then you come to the point where I think a lot of this tends to break down, which is you need to add more data into the model. You need to enhance it to get a better result. And if you just did everything manually and governance was applied manually, your level of effort in order to do this one minor change would be about equal outside of the development component itself to what you started with to build the whole thing. Because you're gonna have to go redo all that testing. You're gonna have to go redo to make sure that you didn't cause problems from the governance perspective. With the data ops approach, you simply add the new tests, run the same review process, and that is where you get these cycle time improvements while not giving up on the data quality, master data management, access management, and data security concerns that have really started to fall off and lead companies into that vicious cycle that David was talking about before of going from reactive back to uncontrolled as these types of changes become too much for the governance organization to keep up with. So in order to really do this, this was all generic, no technologies here. There is a host of new technology, whether that's technology coming through platform providers like AWS or Databricks, or one of the many third parties that have started to pop up to fill in the gaps in this space. So across this, you have technology like data wrangling and pipeline testing technology that fit into the improvement of data quality components so that you can make that codified and repeatable. Similarly, across data discovery, there's ML-driven data catalogs that enable you to take a look at your existing data lake and apply visibility to what's in there so that you can start to govern it on top of that. There's also compliance-focused data catalogs that really help you make sure that you're meeting regulatory requirements and that official approvals are documented, so forth. Moving across, you can find data availability tools like the new world of observability that help you understand exactly what's happening at each step along the way so that those statistical process controls can expand beyond just your tests and a console output to something that really sends alerts and makes people aware when there might be data availability issues so that you can then respond proactively, letting your data consumers know before they would have figured it out by making an incorrect decision or by losing trust in the end state reporting because there may have been a technical issue. Finally, on data security, there are a number of tools that allow you to apply policy-based access management, because that component, the role-based access management model that's been the primary one in use over the last 20 years or so, is starting to really bump up against scaling concerns, especially with the new privacy laws that are now the norm of the world across Europe and parts of America, and will continue to grow in importance over time. So these new approaches to access management allow you to take a code first and flexible approach to build that type of concern into your data pipeline development like we were just showing. So by taking this type of approach, what you're enabling yourself to do is to build data pipelines and then move on to the next value delivery data pipeline without having to worry as much that something's going wrong on the ones you already built, and not having to redo everything when you come back around and need to improve on those because they are driving large value throughout your organization. So what does it really look like in terms of what are the key things that this approach solves for? First one is the ability to balance that innovation angle, so building the prototypes, experimenting, understanding what is really important to your business in terms of what should make that jump to production, and then layering in the development of tests that capture the concerns that are most important from a governance perspective so that you can dial up and dial down on the use case and to increase your maturity over time as your organization gets a few more reps at executing on this, so that you end up governing primarily through guardrails and then adding in those gates only where needed and generally to check that the guardrails are being followed. That means that you need to centralize this data governance approach only where you still have gaps, either in your platform's readiness to apply what we were just talking about, or in areas where the risk or audit concerns need to be centralized within your organization. Next thing you can do here, and I think this was clear throughout the presentation, that you align. That allows you to manage the innovation and risk, but it also leads to motivation. So one of the biggest drivers of the vicious cycle of reactive organizations falling back to uncontrolled is that the motivation to apply the governance in a rigorous way oftentimes is overruled by the motivation to get a high value data product out into the world and realize that value. By aligning the application of governance to the development cycle, those two things are tightly coupled together and they're tightly cohesive in a way that motivates people to get the governance right, so that the risk side of things doesn't end up becoming an excuse to drop the governance concerns. The next thing that you get here is scale, by using that as code approach and not having to go back and redo manual processes over and over again. That enables you to sustain development velocity while making continuous improvement a part of the general data pipeline development process within your organization. You can always release an improvement to pull in a new data source, or to change the way that you are modeling data, or to leverage that new master data that has come online from the build out of another use case as a key enabler to other use cases. So that actually means that you are benefiting from scale instead of struggling with scale. So how do you roll this out to your organization? First thing is that if you're just getting started, you focus on the idea stage first. And you build the data management team up to start out with deep understanding of your data sets and enabling those first few use cases where you're going to apply this. You then have time that's needed to develop the experimental approaches and those prototypes I was just showing before. And that gives that team time to understand how the governance will be applied. So as you get to those prototypes and you need to build out the individual stages and the tests along the way, you will have had 6 weeks or a month at least in order to build up those operating procedures that you're going to be testing out in the first couple of value realization cycles here as you're releasing models. Next is, as you start to get a few things at scale, you leverage the platform to capture those governance metrics. You capture that statistical process control information so that you understand that in production, as things change, you're going to be alerted so that you can then move on to the next things safely. And finally, you can report back on the value of what you're delivering out into production alongside some of the metrics that you're showing that you are not giving up and adding risk along the way, in order to sustain that motivation from the executive level and from the practitioner level to continue doing this on the next 5 things that flow into the pipeline and the next 20 that flow in after that. Now, if this is the way you scale up the team, you also have to think about what's most important to you. Oftentimes we work with clients that have many gaps that they want to fill from a governance perspective, but you can't invest in that waterfall approach where you do everything all at once. And so you need to tie together some of the use cases to the specific data that you want to, or the specific data-driven use case to the specific data goal, whether that's accuracy, availability, completeness, so forth. And then end up building out a plan of where you're going to invest at which times. This allows you to incrementally build up those capabilities without diving into a waterfall approach. And then finally, in order to prioritize across the different initiatives, you shouldn't just have this be a fully decentralized process. You still need some level of executive oversight or leadership oversight that helps determine which areas are going to be increasing the value of the data the most so that the folks on the ground, and we don't mean just data stewards anymore, we mean everybody that's a data product creator or data product owner that's defining those data products. So data analysts, data engineers, data scientists, data quality assurance, all of those folks are responsible for improving your data footprint through the exercising of authority and control through those policies applied during the data pipeline development as code-based tests. So with that, I'd like to switch over and share a few closing thoughts with you. Because what we just focused on is really about leveraging your platform in order to enable the delivery of value while governance is being applied. And that brings together all three pillars here. So if you're looking at an organization and saying, hey, we're doing a great job building out use cases, but we really haven't done data quality well, so we don't know across each one where the data lives, and we don't really have a good way to unify it with a master data approach, you end up in this kind of disjointed situation where you may be proactive in some areas, but then reactive or uncontrolled in others. And what we found is that you really need to move almost not necessarily in lockstep, but in tight alignment across the pillars in order to actually realize the value associated with each maturity stage. And so what that looks like from a governance perspective is if you're uncontrolled right now and you're needing to define those policies that need to be applied, if you're uncontrolled across all three pillars, it'll look like you're just in definition mode, which a lot of clients we work with have started out here, where they're really looking to just move beyond the data as an afterthought to a more modern approach. So they move from definition, and then once that definition exists, the build out of the first few use cases in order to build the integration across the three pillars, which ends up delivering them with an implementation approach. That's really what we were just sharing with that data ops approach, and then also the tie-in between the data ops approach and the ideate, experiment, rollout approach, while building up that enablement approach across the data platform capabilities with the technology we just showed in order to be able to govern along the way while you develop this. And that you oftentimes start out leveraging your governance bodies who really deeply understand your data to help the business ideate on what data could be available to help them execute on value realization. And then over time, what happens is the final stage, as you've done the first 10 laps through the process, you start to find the ways that the three pillars integrate together, the three approaches we just discussed, integrate together to continuously improve upon one another. So going back to one of the examples I shared at the very beginning in the introduction, the manufacturing company we were working with has just recently, after having the 40 people or 40 use cases developed by 700 people, they've just reorganized their business to elevate this function, to elevate their data-focused approach, both on a customer-facing and inward-looking basis, to a top-level concern reporting into the CEO of the company. That means that they are committing to build out the future of their business, not just as the manufacturer of equipment, but as a provider of value-driven solutions to their customers and to the broader agriculture industry. So that's really what it looks like as you hit that modern data enterprise resilient level. And the last thing I want to share then is a brief call to action. So what can you do right now to start your data governance approach? First thing is continue learning about the data ops, some of the technology. I'd encourage you that there's great articles out online right now that we can certainly send out to those that are interested, that can get you into the details of how you do this. What are some of the actual technology implementations? Next step is to really understand your current maturity level, both across the governance and the platform side here, because there is a level of platform maturity required to execute on the data ops approach. So is your current approach working for you? Maybe you haven't scaled up to the level where you need this approach yet, And is your platform capable of supporting that? And then finally, as you look to execute, experiment with layering in those governance activities to the next couple of data product development activities. So the next few data pipelines, the next few dashboards you're building out. Think about how you can say that the data is correct and access controlled at each step along the way. And then use that to understand how you might actually codify that so that you don't have to have somebody go manually check each time, that you can simply just pull up the report that says, yes, this is done. And using that, you can start to understand how these types of techniques will apply in your organization. So with that, we'll jump over to Q&A, and happy to answer your questions here. I know we don't have a ton of time left. I am able to stay on after this. I do want to respect everybody else's time here. So let's jump over to Slido and the MDE governance room. All right. And so looking at the questions here, take them top to bottom, although anyone that's in Slido, you can use the button on the right in order to upvote a question. So if there's one you'd like to get answered, please feel free to upvote that question. I know I pulled in a few of these that were asked as part of the poll, and so we can start with those. First one here, what is MDE's recommendation to governance structure within an organization with multiple layers of decision making? So I think I understand the question here to be, how do you actually centralize versus decentralize this so that you can get input from all of the relevant stakeholders? And as you saw during the presentation, our recommendation around the approach is to make sure that the top level steering committee is deciding what's most important to track. Then you have a set of architect roles that sit across process architecture and platform architecture to help design the implementation approach of how the platform is going to enable this test-driven or code-driven approach. And finally, you have the actual business value side. So during the value workstream, we talked through the approval process of how do you move a experimental data product into something that you're actually going to field test and then roll out. And there's the governance concerns that get applied alongside those business concerns. So the end users of this data set, the stakeholders who are going to adopt it, as well as the executive sponsors of the individual value streams, collaborate together in that gate phase that takes a prototype into production. And so that gate phase really is about taking a look at what has been built up so that you can review the governance status of an individual data product that's in an experimental state and make those value-driven decisions, so risk versus reward trade-offs on assessing whether the current state is actually viable to move into production, and then what activities must be prioritized at a high level in order to set that up. And this is one that I think, in a follow-up discussion, we could talk about the details of how you would implement that and actually draw an org chart. Probably don't have the time here to get into that detail. So I do want to acknowledge that we are at the end time for the session today. I do want to respect everyone's time here, although, like I mentioned, if you would like to stay on, happy to stay on for at least the next half an hour to engage in a discussion. Give everybody a chance to make that decision and then move on to the next question here. So building governance seems like a pretty huge task, even if defined sharply to high priority use cases. How is this done practically? And while that is a large question, I will say that the slide I shared on the rollout process is really how we start to build this up incrementally. So if you think that you're going to go from an ungoverned state to being proactive in governance over the next 3 months, you're likely fooling yourself and going to be driving down more of that waterfall approach that ends up failing in most of our experience. So the practical sense here is you start out with that current state assessment. You understand where your governance councils and existing governance processes, if they exist, are meeting your needs. You then go back and you prioritize the areas where you want to drive continued improvement associated to an individual use case. So this component here, if you don't have any governance organization set up, I think you go back to this approach and say, your governance organization, you build the minimum viable version of it tied to the specific use cases you want to prioritize some of these improvements. You then get executive buy-in around one, education on what everything means here, education on the data ops approach, and a priority order around the data improvements that you want to drive through the governance process tied to a specific use case. Generally, the data improvements you're talking about are, hey, we need to improve the accuracy of manually entered data or of sensor readings that are tied to this specific use case, based on the flow that we showed here. But another flow might be, in order to implement, and this is very common in commercial use cases, in order to implement this, we really need to improve the security and privacy around our customer data so that we can execute on this use case without opening ourselves up to the massive risk associated with GDPR, CCPA, so forth. And then you drive that within your development teams back to the specific things that must be tested for in each stage of your data pipeline. Then as you actually develop that out, you implement those tests. The first one here will slow down, and you have to acknowledge that. So to get back to, this seems like a pretty huge task. It's not inconsequential, but by slicing it down to something that's tied to value, you are not necessarily trying to take on the whole thing at once, and you're building up your capability incrementally. So you have to grow not only the technology platform capabilities, the understanding of the development teams, but also the understanding of those people who are actually sitting in those gate meetings of what has been done and how it actually works. So a lot of people and a lot of process and technology has to mature together in order to really make this successful. And it is not inconsequential the way that you do that. So this is something that we spend a lot of our time discussing with our customers, building training programs, documenting the process flows around this, while also building out that underlying data platform to support it. And like I mentioned before, we are on a Zoom meeting here. So if Nick, if you are on and you'd like to follow up on that question, happy to take that. Otherwise, we can move on to the next one.
No, thanks, Ryan. This is Nick. I appreciate that. I think one of our challenges has been, getting our arms around what governance means for us, and then, trying to move from current to future state, but also still getting the day job done. And I think that's been there's a lot of inertia to overcome in getting there. But I think the
initial motivators, if that, oftentimes the initial motivators go back to the classic ones, right? You have these high value use cases you're executing on, but there are also high risk elements that are going to be tied to them if you don't start to build out this approach incrementally. And so that type of, the $15 million a year from bad data quality, or the average cost of a data breach being at like $8 million, are often motivating to get the investment on the initial platform and design phase of this tied to those first use cases.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Next one in the list here is, how do you recommend that organizations implement master data management? And That's actually a really good question, because it's one of the things that's less obvious when you're talking about the data ops approach, is how do you actually do the master data management component of this? Is that something that is a separate effort from the development of a specific use case? Is it something where you tie each use case development process to have some, hey, if you're touching master data, you need to allocate time to continue to improve on that? And I don't know that in our experience, and David, feel free to chime in here, or anybody else on the Parievda side from the panel, that there's a true right answer to that. I've seen some success in the former of those things, of trying to tie the improvement of master data to those use cases that impact that master data, but that requires some of the same initial buy-in conversations, again, showing the industry experience around the value of master data initiatives, but saying we're going to take a different approach to the way we execute on this than what you might just buy if you're going with a master data management vendor. And we're going to leverage our data lake and our data catalog and maybe some of the data wrangling tools, or potentially just more of a code-driven approach to actually build out that master data model and the data dictionary definitions around it, while flowing data from different sources into that defined model in the earlier stages of the pipeline. So I know that's an incomplete answer, and welcome to anybody else on the Parievda side that might want to chime in there. If not, we can move on. And if you were the one who asked this question, happy to follow up and have a more in-depth discussion. All right. So next one, how do you add governance to a data lake that already exists? There's a couple of tool-based approaches that certainly have made that easier recently. So the AWS Lake Formation service that's built on top of the Glue catalog that they provide is one of those. So if you're on the AWS platform, you have that as a relatively low-cost option to take a data lake built on S3 and scan to understand all of the data that is currently in place. I'll go back to the technology slide here. Come on. There we go. So talking about here, this compliance type catalog where you can use the Glue data catalog using the Lake Formation service to build it up over your existing data. Similarly, I think Waterline Data is one of the best commercial vendors in this space that does a really good job of doing data fingerprinting. So it'll almost, it'll automate a little bit more of the process, potentially even identifying which master data sources are tied to which data sets within your data lake. And then on top of these solutions, you can start to layer in some of the data access controls. So Lake Formation provides its own access control layer that, as long as you're coming in through other AWS services like Athena or EMR or other AWS technology, applies the security at the Lake Formation level so that the data you've then discovered is able to have that access management applied. And then finally, the data quality components of that can be layered in on top of the code that is actually filling in that data lake. So one of the things that Waterline does that Lake Formation and Glue currently don't is try to automatically detect some of the data lineage. So which source data products led to which downstream data products. And then the next step would be going back manually to your business to find the people who understand what technology is actually being used to take an input source and produce an output. And then you can start to layer in something like Great Expectations for test management on top of those data sets. So Great Expectations is a Python library that enables you to author data tests using SQL, Spark, or Python underlying implementations. That's really good for layering in some of the testing approach to pipelines that already exist. Again, if you're on and you want to ask a follow-up, you're always welcome to. Otherwise, we'll move on to this last question here. All right, so what solutions have we utilized for data quality remediation? And the way I'm reading it, remediation is a key word here. And you may want to focus in on not just implementing data quality for new data pipelines that are flowing in, but addressing data quality issues in existing data. And so oftentimes you hear the role data custodian used to help describe the person or people that are actually executing on this. So you have data, you know that there are data quality issues. Oftentimes there is either resistance or an inability to correct that data at the source. And so you have to develop an approach for how you clean up the data as part of the data pipeline. And so then there's, I think you correctly noted that there's automated approaches and then there's human touch approaches here. So I think you probably heard me hammer the point home that you can build tests along your data pipelines that allow you to have that automated statistical process control approach. But what about those scenarios where you haven't built those tests and you already have potentially bad data in place that needs to be cleaned up? You know, the traditional approach in a data warehouse would be to go build some SQL scripts that execute and clean up the data for you. These days, data wrangling tools provide a great visual interface to facilitate the work that those people do. And there are more traditional data quality tools that, while I don't think that they fit very well within the data ops approach, they are good for the manual data cleanup approach. So Talend has a good product there. There's other ones within Informatica's data suite. And those can be used to bring in a broader base of users who may not understand how to write SQL scripts or how to write the Python code in order to generate great expectations tests, but want to view that data in an Excel-like format, see where it's bad, indicate that that's bad, and then auto-generate a set of rules that will correct for that problem. Oftentimes, these tools are already in existence at larger organizations, and they're being used by data wrangling or data science teams in order to get data ready to build specific machine learning models. But they can definitely be applied more broadly to help facilitate that data cleanup effort. Then in terms of actually driving where you focus those people, because likely cases you have a number of different areas where you can execute on this, you take the approach we discussed earlier and tie that back into the specific areas where it's going to drive the most value. So cleaning up the accuracy of your sales data is going to affect sales forecasts the most. Improving compliance related concerns on your customer profile data for online cross-sell models is going to be driving down the risk associated with that customer data. Some of these are obvious as you get into the specific context for your business. You know, the timeliness of your supply chain data is another really good example of a data set that's kind of useless if you only get it once a week because the parts have already shown up, been put into the machine, and then been shipped out to a warehouse by the time you know that there was an issue. So that type of prioritization process, thinking about what does this data quality metric map back to in terms of value to help prioritize, is the second part of that answer. There we go. Again, any follow-up questions are welcome. If not, that was the last question here, and I think we can sign off for the day. I really appreciate everybody's attention. I appreciate the questions and look forward to driving some discussions, whether those are just discussions that we're having with you, or whether those are discussions that you're having within your own organization about these approaches and how they tie together the three pillars of the modern data enterprise. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.